Hello and thanks for joining us on Global Watch. I'm Zhao Yang in Beijing. We start in Afghanistan. The Taliban have denied reports that they plan to inaugurate the interim government on September 11th. Officials said plans for a ceremony were cancelled days ago, and the government is already at work after key posts were announced earlier this week. US President Joe Biden has called for national unity as the country marks the 20th anniversary of the September 11th terror attacks. On Saturday, Biden will visit the sites where the planes crashed. Nearly 3,000 people were killed in the attacks in 2001. 9/11 served as the justification for the US to launch its global war on terror, which began with its invasion of Afghanistan. As the US finally pulled out its troops from the country after 20 years and conducted a massive airlift of its citizens and Afghan partners, the Islamic State launched a suicide attack on Kabul airport, killing 170 people and 13 US troops. On Tuesday, the Taliban announced the formation of an interim government in what is now known as the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said the Islamist group needs to earn any international legitimacy and support. Now let's get more insight, and we're joined by Hamza Momin Hakimi, Professor of Law and Political Science at Salam University in Kabul, and Joseph Gregory Mahoney, Professor of Politics at East China Normal University, and he joins us from Memphis in the US. Gentlemen, good to have you both with us on Global Watch. Now, I'd like to pose a question to the both of you. So we know that the Taliban reports are saying they've cancelled the new government's inauguration ceremony, but officials have also dismissed reports that they originally planned to hold these events on September 11th, today, hold the swearing in then. What's the message being sent here, considering the timing for the 9/11 anniversary? And let's start with Mr. Hakimi.
Good morning to you and to your viewers, and thank you for having me today. I think Taliban did not have this plan to launch the ceremony of announcing the government today, because it would give a false message to the world, a connection between Taliban and the 9/11. 9/11 terror attacks had no connection with Taliban, no ties with Taliban. It is being claimed by the US that it was done by Al-Qaeda, who were at the time in Afghanistan. No solid evidence presented. No court has decided or ruled that it was Al-Qaeda in Afghan territory has been used for 9/11 attacks. That's why holding a ceremony in an anniversary of 9/11 would give a kind of false message that Taliban was somehow involved in 9/11. 9/11 was something purely unrelated to Afghanistan, unrelated to Taliban, and unrelated to the Afghan people. Though Afghan people has paid a huge cost for what has happened in 9/11. It was its attack on Afghanistan, an attack which caused 250,000 of casualties in Afghanistan, civilian casualties in Afghanistan. Hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives as a result of that attack. And that attack has nothing to do with Afghanistan people and Afghan people. And yet the US department, the US administration did not present any solid evidence that shows that it was Afghanistan lands were used for this attack. None of the attackers were Afghan nation. None of the attackers was helped by any Afghan, yet not proved. So I think that it's a totally irrelevant ceremony for Taliban. I don't think that Taliban would have had any plan to launch their ceremony on the 9/11 attacks anniversary.
All right, and Professor Mahoney, do you have anything to add on that question?
My comments run in tandem with much of what he says. Clearly, they understand that it would be extremely poor form to celebrate on 9/11. You know, many, including America's competitors, recall that tragic day with empathy. So it would certainly undermine Taliban efforts to cultivate support and recognition from the global community. And I do think we have to recall that the Taliban were not directly responsible for 9/11, and ultimately that they and Afghanistan suffered more because of those attacks than the US did. So it's a dark day for everyone and unsuitable for inauguration.
And Professor Mahoney, you were in Washington on the day of the terror attacks. Would you share with us your experience and how you think that's weighed on the American consciousness?
Yeah, I was just a couple blocks from the White House when the attack started in New York, and then the Pentagon was hit, and we heard that. And then there were radio reports that the plane had turned in Pennsylvania and was coming towards us in D.C. We were in the streets by then, and all of a sudden we heard explosions overhead. People were scared, they ducked, they screamed. But it was the Air Force, fighter jets rushing in to the Capitol airspace to provide air cover, breaking the sound barrier as they arrived. And you know, I recall that moment still with strong emotions, and believe that those feelings of fear, which were new to many Americans, were deeply damaging to our national psyche and led us to blindly follow our leaders down a long, dark path of unjust war, assassinations, extraordinary renditions, torture, and other terrors that we brought to people in return. And this feeling led us to squander so much positive potential and saw us destroy our own values and ourselves along the way. And I think the Taliban retaking power in Kabul underscore this legacy in a very visceral way.
And Professor Hakimi, Afghanistan bore the consequences of the attacks for the last 20 years. How would you say Afghans reflect back on the last 20 years and how it's come full circle back to the Taliban?
Yeah, as your distinguished guest said from the Washington, that there were sounds of the aircrafts breaking the air barrier in the sky of Washington, D.C. Afghan people have been living the last 20 years with the similar sounds, with an addition that there were blasts of bombings from those airplanes as well, and strikes from those airplanes on Afghanistan soil. Afghan people have been living a life of terror, a life of horror after that attack on USA. As I said, we have paid a very expensive cost for that. Not only that, the USA was here in Afghanistan with the agenda of reconstruction of Afghanistan society ideologically and based on what they said is the Western norms and Western ideology. So they tried very hard in Afghanistan, but at last they have failed. And after 20 years, 4 American presidents and trillions of dollars spent in Afghanistan, as I said, 250,000 lives taken in Afghanistan. After that, we are again with a 0 point, starting with Taliban ruling once again, with Taliban once again controlling over Afghanistan. So the big question for Afghans is that why US did that, and why they were in Afghanistan and they are out now with nothing, just holding some cards for pressuring Taliban, economic cards for their own, some of their benefits which are still remaining in Afghanistan, pointing to that economic cards for pressuring Taliban to keep those benefits only and only. So there's still big question with Afghans that why Americans did that, and this question will someday would rise in the international community with courts, and may justice be provided for Afghans in the future.
All right, thank you both, gentlemen. Please do stay with us. We'll come back to you shortly. Now we want to go back to Kabul, where Kathy Gannon is live for us. She's the Associated Press News Director for Afghanistan and Pakistan. Kathy, good to have you with us. Now I want to talk to you a bit more about some of these reports that we've been hearing about the Taliban cancelling the inauguration events that were reportedly scheduled for September 11th, and it would have sent quite a message, maybe the wrong message as well. And now the Taliban reportedly saying that this is all rumors. What can you tell us?
Yeah, well, I mean, in fact, there were no announcements of a September 11th inauguration. The Taliban did not make any announcement that they would be swearing in their cabinet. Before the cabinet was appointed, there was talk that there would be a swearing in, that they would invite world leaders from Russia, from China, from Pakistan. But after the cabinet was announced, there were no announcements by the Taliban that there would be any swearing-in ceremony. So, in fact, what the Taliban are saying is true, that, there were some news stories came out, there were some reports, but in fact, there had been no public announcements by them that there would be a swearing-in ceremony today.
Well, Kathy, the Taliban said in a statement that they wanted healthy, strong relations with their neighbors, other countries. What have they done so far to foster that?
Yeah, well, it's the early days. There certainly have been repression of women, marches, journalists who've been attacked. And at the other side of it, there's also been efforts by the Taliban to try to show a different face. They were very cooperative, for example, with the U.S. in terms of organizing these last commercial flights out of Afghanistan with Qatar. Something like 350 foreign nationals, Americans, Germans, French, Canadian, have left Afghanistan in the last 2-3 days on commercial flights provided by Qatar Airways. So it's been a mixed picture here in Kabul. On one side, you get a sense of some of that repression that was evident during their last time in power, and also you get another phase where they are trying to say, okay, it's a different time, it's a different era, we're a different rulers with the same ideology, though. And so how does that fit into the 21st century? And I think they, too, are probably grappling with that.
All right. Well, Kathy, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Kathy Gannon, Associated Press News Director for Afghanistan and Pakistan in Kabul. Well, the Taliban drew from its highest ranks to fill top posts in Afghanistan's new government. The acting premier was once an associate of the militant group's founder. The interior minister is wanted on a U.S. terrorism list. Well, here's a look at some of the key members of the new government.
The Taliban militant group has announced an interim government, declaring the country the Islamic Emirate. Mullah Muhammad Hassan Akhund will lead the cabinet as prime minister. He's one of the 4 men who founded the Taliban in 1994. And the new prime minister is a longtime head of Taliban's leadership council. He's under UN sanctions for his role as foreign minister and deputy prime minister during the Taliban's rule from 1996 to 2001. Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar will be the deputy prime minister of the Taliban interim government. He is also a Taliban co-founder. He has been the head of Taliban's political office in Qatar since January 2019. In 2020, Baradar became the first Taliban leader to communicate directly with the U.S. president after a phone call with Donald Trump. He also signed the Doha Agreement on the withdrawal of U.S. troops on behalf of the Taliban. Sirajuddin Haqqani, the new interior minister, is considered by Washington to be a terrorist. He is one of the FBI's most wanted men due to alleged involvement in suicide attacks and ties to al-Qaeda. Haqqani became the new leader of the Haqqani network, which has been credited with some of the most violent attacks against Afghan forces and their Western allies in recent years. The group, designated by the U.S. as a terrorist organization, oversees the Taliban's financial and military assets along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border.
Well, let's get back to Professors Hakimi and Mahoney. Thank you both for sticking around. Professor Mahoney, now when you consider the reputation of some of the Taliban government leaders, as we've just seen, how difficult will it be for this government to gain legitimacy and recognition internationally?
Many in that movement are wanted, and this is unsurprising because they've been fighting an insurgency against Western occupiers for a long time. But I don't think we should be too distracted by these individuals. The bigger problem is that the Taliban as a whole is still designated a foreign terrorist organization by the U.S. And what this really means is that everyone in that movement is wanted in some respect or another. This designation places severe restrictions on what sort of interactions can take place as well as aid. So, to say that this is really a problem of a few individuals it's really the whole organization that the U.S. is unable to recognize and deal with.
Well, the position that most current governments, or Afghan watchers have been saying is judge the Taliban by their actions, not their words. But how do we do that? What are the criteria? Professor Mahoney.
Well, the U.S. in particular has, the U.S. in particular has a bad habit of holding others to standards higher than it holds itself. The fact is, the U.S. did not bring peace and prosperity to Afghanistan. It didn't even liberate the women, as it likes to pretend. And instead, it's left a terrible mess while restricting aid and support. It's impossible for the Taliban to meet criteria that the U.S. itself was unable to meet. And instead, I don't think we should be surprised if they face circumstances that will provoke poor outcomes for which they will be held accountable, fairly or not.
And Professor Hakimi, what are your thoughts on how we judge the Taliban for their actions, by whose criteria, and also what can these Talib leaders do to gain international recognition? What are the first steps for them?
Actually, this statement that we are going to judge Taliban by their actions, not their words, leave the window open for any future faction with Taliban, future deals with Taliban, and possibly future recognition by the international community. I'm sorry to say, but that's the reality. The international community is a hypocrite community dealing with Afghanistan. They are posing some standards. They are talking about some standards of human rights and women's rights and other freedoms for Taliban to be recognized internationally. But we see at the same time that the US and the European countries are dealing with the country, are close allies with those countries that they do not respect those rights. They do not have those freedoms at all. So I think, and I can clearly state that it is not a matter of importance for the US and for the European country and Western society, the rights and human rights and freedoms in Afghanistan. What the matter for them would be their benefits in Afghanistan. Their benefits, which is under threat because of the vacuum of withdrawal of Americans and the Western troops from Afghanistan, Taliban, because of the turn that Afghanistan will take from the Western Bloc to the Eastern Bloc, to what Afghanistan naturally belongs to, the regional powers in Afghanistan, the direct and indirect neighbors of Afghanistan. They will look after their benefits in Afghanistan in the future, which will contradict with the benefits of US and Europe in Afghanistan, economic and social, political benefits in Afghanistan. That's why they are talking about the actions of Taliban. They will not be too much worried about who is in the list of the Taliban's government, whether he is an FBI wanted or not. This FBI wanted person, America chased him for 20 years in Afghanistan, not only failed in chasing him, but was defeated by the same person in Afghanistan. And now they're facing him as a Ministry of Interior in Afghanistan. So the message from Taliban is very clear, that the era of dictation of norms from America is gone, and they are not allowed to anymore interfere in Afghanistan internal affairs. Afghans will decide about that. But there are some actual recommendations from Taliban. Afghanistan territory not being used by any terrorist group, which is very important. Peace and stability in Afghanistan, which is very important not only for Afghans but for our neighbors and the regional powers in Afghanistan. The drugs issue and also the illegal migration issues. There are some important points, first for Europeans and then for Americans in the future for Taliban to meet with this criteria, I think.
Well, Professor Hakimi, to follow up on that, the Taliban in its statements have been fairly reassuring, fairly compromising in terms of what it will offer domestically. But in terms of actions, have you seen a different Taliban so far, some actions to indicate that it is going to deliver what it's promising?
Well, comparing Taliban with their past version in the 1990s, they have actually changed. They are dealing with different mentality. They are dealing not only with the mentality of militant group, but they are dealing with a state ruling mentality now. But I think it's yet to decide, it's yet to judge about Taliban, what they are going to do. They have It's less than a month that they have a control of the capital, and less than a week that they have announced their interim government or their caretaking government. So it is yet to judge about Taliban. Mostly the media is focusing on the government, on the briefcases of the ministries that who are dealing with that. But I think there are major questions more important than the briefcases of ministries who is holding them. For example, that whether we are going to see a rule in Afghanistan under a constitution, would we have a constitution, who would have the sovereignty in Afghanistan, whether the people of Afghanistan would be a sovereign or a person or one group would be a sovereign in Afghanistan, whether there be a check and balance in Afghanistan in the future, whether there be a free judiciary in Afghanistan or not, whether there be a separation of power between the organs of the state, the executive and the judiciary, and the federal government. So these are more important questions on the ground or on the table that we are looking for its answer from Taliban's action actually, and it's yet to judge about.